Pokémon was a cultural phenomenon that took the world by storm during the late 90s. Starting with the release of Red and Green in Japan in 1996, and following it up with the Western release of Red and Blue in 1998, these games were the de facto reason to own a Game Boy. This massive success meant that the Pokémon franchise would spread out to other avenues, including merchandise, a collectible trading card game, and most notably, a long-running anime adaptation. To many kids, the anime was a thing that could have potentially been considered more recognizable than the games themselves. Nintendo and Game Freak paid very close attention to this success, and before the release of Pokémon 2nd Generation, we were treated to a slightly updated version of Red and Blue entitled Pokémon Yellow, which had a strong influence from the anime that was running at the time. Today's video is going to be rather brief, as we are going to jump into Pokémon Yellow and just see what made it so different from Red and Blue, if it changed too much or not enough. And is this a definitive way to experience Generation 1? Well, let's talk about Pokémon Yellow. Pokémon Yellow, as the third game in the Generation 1 lineup, is often seen as the best version of that game. In my opinion, while I do think it definitely shines brighter than Red and Blue in a few areas, I also wouldn't say that it's the clear-cut definitive way to experience the classic Kanto feel. Personally, I wouldn't necessarily rate it any better or worse than I would the other Gen 1 games. It still has many of the strange quirks that Red and Blue had to offer, but goes ahead and improves on the presentation, fixes a number of bugs, adds some additional story elements, and shapes the entire game around the Pokémon anime. On the other hand, there are a few changes that ultimately have a slightly more negative impact on the overall game, which, while not a deal breaker by any means, definitely has to be considered when deciding which game fits your playstyle best. Pokémon Yellow represents the first in the line of the definitive entries in a generation of the series. This will be followed up on in later generations with releases such as Crystal, Emerald, and Platinum. Now, all of those games were still pretty true to the original titles, but they also made some pretty large changes to the pacing, availability of content, and sometimes even the story as a whole. Pokémon Yellow, by comparison, is rather tame and really doesn't change much. You still follow pretty much the same story, with being a trainer from Pallet Town who collects a Pokedex from Professor Oak, has frequent run-ins with their rival Blue, battles the nefarious Team Rocket, collects all 8 gym badges, and then takes on the Elite Four to become the Pokemon champion of Kanto. The way you encounter, battle, catch, train, and trade Pokemon has gone relatively unchanged. Except for a few small exceptions, all of the areas are identical, the characters all have the same exact lines of dialogue, and you encounter all of these NPCs in the same exact places as you did before. This can lead to the experience being very samey, especially if you recently played at the Red and Blue and were expecting a little bit more of a substantial update. One of the most notable improvements for Pokémon Yellow from Red and Blue was in the graphical department. Now, for the most part, the overworld sprites are basically the same, with some additional sprite work added for NPCs and Pokémon. The big addition was the added color that was brought in. Assuming you were playing on a Game Boy Color, GBA, one of the Virtual Console releases, hell, really anything other than the standard Game Boy. These add a little bit more vibrance to the overworld at best, and a few headache-inducing areas at worst. In the battle scenes, Pokemon are not only more appropriately colored, but they also receive new battle sprites, and hot damn, these actually look like the Pokemon they were meant to represent. Brock and Misty also had their battle sprites updated to be in line with their anime counterparts too. This isn't a graphical overhaul by any means, but it definitely makes the game more visually appealing. Possibly the biggest change in Pokémon Yellow to the formula that Red and Blue had established was the removal of the choice of a starter Pokémon, in favor of giving players a Pikachu as the de facto partner. Now, Pikachu isn't necessarily a bad Pokémon. In fact, with the limited number of electric types available in the early to mid game, Pikachu is actually a pretty useful choice. However, there are a couple of challenges that come with having Pikachu. First off, since Pikachu is your starter, it really can make Brock kind of a hard first gym leader unless you go out of your way to get a Mankey to deal with the rock types. Secondly, you can't evolve this Pikachu into a Raichu, which is a massive hit to how effective your starter can actually be. It's not all bad though. You do get to have Pikachu follow you around outside of its Pokeball, which is pretty cool, and it's something that they actually brought back in Gen 4. Pikachu also has a prototype of the happiness mechanic that was later introduced into Gen 2, and while it doesn't have a ton of gameplay implications, it does add a little bit of charm. So one of the biggest things that determine which version of Pokemon a person decides to get is what Pokemon are available to the player. Thankfully, I think Yellow has the overall best selection of Pokemon in regards to the Generation 1 games. You essentially get all of the Pokemon in Generation 1 available, minus a few notable exceptions. Mainly being the Pokemon that Team Rocket was known for using, such as the Arbok, Weezing, and Persian lines, Raichu because no wild Pikachus can be caught and evolved, the Beedrill line, as well as Jynx, Electabuzz, and Magmar. Not entirely sure why those last few were not available, but it's a small price to pay in order to have the other 137 Pokemon all obtainable by the player. Probably the best feature of this is that you can get Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle all relatively early in the game, allowing the player to have all of the standard starters at one time. This is definitely a little overpowered, but I think it's awesome and I'd love to see other Pokemon games give players the options to do this. Outside of the changes made to the player options, one of the other big gameplay differences you might notice has to do with the gym leaders and the rival and with the Pokemon that they have. Many of the gym leaders saw changes to their lineup of Pokemon to match what they have in the anime, and if I'm being honest, I'm not the biggest fan of most of those changes. Brock and Misty stay pretty much the same, but Lieutenant Surge loses both his Voltorb and Pikachu and only has a beefed up Raichu, which is honestly pretty lame. Erica has her Vileplume and Victory Bell both in their previous evolutions, making her easier as well. Koga? Jesus Christ, what did they do to Koga? Getting rid of his entire team to get him a Venomoth, which is okay, but then also 3 Venonats? Why? Sabrina's team is now just the entire Alakazam line, which is a slight downgrade from her team from before. Blaine's team I actually slightly prefer, but I still wish we could have maybe seen a Magmar added too since he was on Blaine's team in the anime. Also, Giovanni having a Persian is good for anime representation, but bad for being a ground-type gym leader. And then the rivals team is just fine, I guess. I prefer the team from Red and Blue though. While the majority of the story of Pokemon Yellow stays the same as Red and Blue, there are a few notable additions. The beginning of the game actually has some of the biggest of these changes. Oak now catches a Pikachu out in the wild before taking Red back to his lab, and Blue now takes an Eevee as his starter Pokemon instead of the superior choice of the player. This Eevee will now either evolve into a Jolteon, Flareon, or Vaporeon depending on how the player does in their first couple of encounters. The other biggest change that Pokemon Yellow's story sees is the addition of Jessie and James from the anime as almost higher-ranking members of Team Rocket. They aren't really referred to by name and they don't have the talking Meowth, but make no mistake about it, this is still Jessie and James. They show up periodically throughout the game, giving Team Rocket a little bit more depth. Most of the other story changes are pretty minor, such as Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny being added to replace the nurses and police officers in the base game, so there really isn't much else to cover in regards to story. So while Pokemon Yellow has its fair share of substantial and noticeable differences to Red and Blue, there are plenty of other things that are actually also changed that are notable that really don't have that much of an impact gameplay-wise. I'm just going to go ahead and list some of the ones that I noticed really quickly. Some of the biggest glitches, such as the Missing No glitch, were patched out, which can make leveling more of a grind for the late game areas. Cerulean Cave now has a completely changed layout. A Surfing Pikachu minigame was made available for anyone who had a Pikachu that knew the move Surf. Many of the Pokédex entries were changed from what they were in Red and Blue. Some places of purchase, such as the Pokemarts and Game Corner, saw adjustments to the items available and prices of certain items. Some of the in-game trades with other players were removed or altered to different Pokemon. The Old Man of Viridian now gives a mandatory tutorial on how to catch a Pokemon. You can enter the Savari Zone now without paying if you're too poor. There's a trash can by Professor Oak now. That's important. Yeah, there's probably more that I can't think of right now, but those are some of the ones that I noticed. So, with all that in mind, is Pokemon Yellow really worth a recommendation? Well, yeah, I definitely would say it is. A lot of the changes that Pokemon Yellow had from Red and Blue were honestly pretty minor, and it's a safe bet to say that if you enjoyed those games, this one would suit you just fine. Again, most of the weird Generation 1 decisions are still present, but the core gameplay is still as fun as ever, the world is fun to explore, and it can be cool to see what little changes they made with this version of the game. If you still haven't played a Generation 1 Pokemon game, this would be an excellent place to start. But that's all I got for you guys today. What were your thoughts on Pokemon Yellow? Please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below, and hey, if you enjoyed today's video, maybe consider giving it a like and subscribing. Thank you guys again, and I'll catch you in the next video.